In his foundational essay, What is the History of Books, written in 1982, Robert Darnton described the life cycle of the printed book as a communication circuit that runs from the author to the publisher, if the bookseller does not assume that role, to printer, to the shipper, the bookseller, and the reader. There are many more players in the game, including editors, designers, lawyers, translators, collectors. And I've done my best over the years to interview as many of them as I can find. Today, I'm speaking with a writer who has crushed Darnton's circuit. Paul Wells has been a political journalist in Ottawa for 30 years. He wrote for Maclean's magazine for 19 years and has written for the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and other publications. He's a regular commentator on television and radio in English et en français. He's written award-winning best-selling books on politics, and he's now on Substack, an online newsletter platform, enjoying his greatest success ever?
Arguably
His greatest success ever. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thanks.
Let's start with what you do when writing about politics.
Golly, I mean, so it depends to some extent on the situation, but I observe what's going on. I talk to the participants. I read some history. I remember some history more and more because I've been at this for a while. I try and put current events into context. One of the most common pitfalls in politics is to think that what's going on now is unprecedented. And it's almost never unprecedented. And the precedents are usually instructive. So a lot of what I do is to say, this is how it goes. That what we're going through is an example of some dynamic that we've seen before in our history, or that some place has seen in its history. And that doesn't dictate the outcome, but it gives us some hints about what the outcome might be. So that's the sort of thing. It's the sort of attitude that I bring into the arena, I guess, when I write.
Darnton's just come out with another book about Paris pre-revolution, and he calls it the information age. There's just as much information buzzing around there in all sorts of different ways back then as there is today.
Yeah. That's a lovely thought. I doubt that it's true. I think while you've been setting up, I've gotten more useful or useless information on my phone than I would have had in pre-revolutionary Paris.
You might have to read his book.
Yeah. Well, it's almost certainly true that there were dozens of newspapers in Paris, or hundreds of newspapers in Paris at the time, rather than a few today. And
there were pamphleteers, which is what I want to get into.
Yeah. Well, and an awful lot of the information that's available today is not packaged coherently and doesn't advance an argument, and therefore might not be as useful. But just the amount of stuff raining down on us is formidable.
And interfering with our lives in a different way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I wrote a book about Stephen Harper just before social media, and I wrote a book about Stephen Harper at the height of the sort of Twitter boom. And concentrating long enough to do my damn job was much harder the second time around.
Yeah.
It was way harder to focus on long-term goal in 2013 than it had been in 2006. And I mean, 5 years after that, 2018, I just got off Twitter. I was like, oh.
Yes. I loved you on Twitter, and that's why I followed you to Substack, or eventually, because there was a little period where I had to go to Facebook to get you.
Yeah.
Which wasn't that much fun.
No. I mean, and I always try and be competent to produce journalism at every available scale. So from tweets to books. But Twitter more and more was just a place for people to try and beat each other up, and it was not, frankly, good for my mental health. Mm-hmm. So off I went.
Darnton talks about the circuit, what happens between when the author writes something and when the public reads it or their audience reads it, and all the different people that are involved in between. You were a newspaper reporter to start with?
Yep.
What was that like? Who interfered with your stuff before the reader got to see it?
Most often I was a city reporter for the Montreal Gazette before I moved to Ottawa. So there'd be a city assignment editor who would tell me what to do that day. I would produce a story by the close of the business day, and that would go to desk editors, essentially story handlers. They would look for grammar mistakes, they would look for potential factual mistakes, they would clean up style, and then it would go to slot, which is trying to figure out where on the page it's going to fit, which page of the paper it's going to fit on, and then headline people. There'd be about 4 or 5 people between me and the reader. And then down to the press room, because we still had presses on premises in those days, and loaded up on the trucks, and just like you see in the movies. Especially in those days, often I was up late enough and out late enough so that a newspaper runner would sell me a copy of the paper with the story that I'd written 5 or 6 hours earlier.
Were you frustrated by the difference between what you had written and what appeared in the paper?
Yeah, quite a bit. Now, it helps that my copy was always quite clean. I don't make a lot of typological, grammatical mistakes, and so that gave an editor fewer excuses to start meddling with my stuff. Mm-hmm. Secondly, these people are good at their job. I mean, the Montreal Gazette was an interesting paper because people worked there because they loved Montreal who could reasonably have worked anywhere else. And it was very selective. You had to have some understanding of French. You had to understand sort of the complexities of that society. So, yeah, it bugs you to see somebody incompetently change your work. But it was very rarely incompetent at the Gazette. Usually the editors were improving my work.
I was going to say, so you feel that most of your work, if it was interfered with, was improved?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then if I disagreed, we could have a fight over it,
right.
And
defend your...
Yeah, and the great thing about newspapering, the great thing about journalism in general is, like, tomorrow's another day, right? Like, if you lose the fight today, then you just figure out how not to lose it the next time, and,
But did you got to say exactly what you wanted to say?
Yeah, so everyone's got a theory about how some interest is crushing honest journalism, right? Mm-hmm. So when I was young, people who'd read a little bit of Noam Chomsky figured that we were conspiring to construct capitalism and crush the working man. And these days, it's conservatives who think that we're here to prop up the activist state, and I think partly because my own politics, my own reactions to things are not particularly extreme on any side. I've never noticed much of that going on. Chomsky would say I'm a perfect newsroom journalist because I don't even get that I should be writing something else.
You don't know you're a fish, and you don't know you're swimming in water.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And honestly, look, I mean, you're in my office. Yeah, it's empty. You're the second or third person who's been in the office who wasn't me, and I've been here for 2 years, right? What I miss is teams and collaboration.
We're now talking you as Substack, is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I moved from Montreal to Ottawa 30 years ago, from large bureaus to smaller bureaus as circumstances changed and really as the industry collapsed. And anyone who used to work in a large newsroom misses a large newsroom, because most of those interactions are not a hassle. They're, if you're any kind of social animal at all, they're part of improving the work, and they're part of improving the product.
And plus, there's a bunch of smart people.
Yeah, and so anyone who's seen the Ron Howard movie The Paper, which is a kind of cartoon version of what goes on in a really real daily newspaper, one thing it captures very well is the interaction of a bunch of eccentrics who really are not great at having a life outside of the newsroom. They get into the newsroom and it completes them. The central character's wife is about to have a baby, and she misses being in a newsroom because she's also a journalist. She misses being in a newsroom terribly. I've never had a baby, but I know what it's like to miss a newsroom.
So you went to a smaller bureau and you changed mediums to get into magazines then? yes?
Yeah.
So what was the difference between newspaper and magazine?
So the thing that was really striking at the time, I mean, I quit the National Post because I disagreed with some decisions that the owners had made.
Conrad?
No, his successors, the Aspers. I knew that at some point they were going to fire the editor of the Post, Ken White, because new owners always fire editors.
Yeah. It's like new ministers, right?
Well, this is it. So I would like to be realistic. I had a list of potential new editors that I'd be happy to work with. And without going into names and personalities, the person they named was not on my list. So I quit a week later.
Feel good?
Yeah. Everyone should quit in anger at least once.
Oh, yeah, it's great.
And then Tony Wilson-Smith, who was the editor of Maclean's in those days, was nice enough to hire me for the recently vacated back page that Fotheringham had been at for so long. Wonderful situation, wonderful platform.
And how did that differ from what you were doing with the paper?
Well, the main thing was I'd get to the end of the week and I'd have all these opinions that I had no place for, right? Because at a daily newspaper, I'd been a columnist in papers for, well, with the National Post, more than 5 years, and used to a daily tempo. And then suddenly you're asked for one column a week, and I'd be like, well, I was angry about the budget, and I thought that minister was impressive, and so on. And so very quickly, within several weeks of starting at Maclean's, I started a blog, which was simply an outlet for, in those pre-social media days, for all my extra opinions and witty aperçus and whatever,
So this was filling in the period between the appearance of the columns on the back page.
Yeah.
And again, this was free for the public to read.
Yeah, and apparently quite terrifying for Rogers, which owned Maclean's and didn't have a blogging policy, and suddenly they had a guy who was blogging, and so they had I was told much later they had a bunch of emergency meetings on what the hell is our blogging policy going to be? What are our employees allowed to say? But that was a product of moving from daily, where I was writing each day for tomorrow, to weekly, where I was writing often several days in advance of when it was going to be seen. This is a common magazine challenge, and it's part of the joy of writing for a periodical, is figuring out how you can write something that's going to last at least until the street date of the magazine. But while I was puzzling through that, I didn't want to lose the immediacy, so I was permitted to start a blog because I'd already been writing it before anyone decided what they thought of the idea.
And you were making the same money or more?
Roughly the same.
Right. And doing about the same amount of work.
Yeah. I mean, I've never been too fastidious about accounting my hours. I mean, I don't know when the last time, and it would count in decades. I don't know when the last time I asked anyone to pay me for overtime. Because often when I'm at work, I'm sort of half working. And then...
Yes, and then you go home and think,
so
that's included too, right?
So I don't know how you count that, And so the question you asked, did I make as much at Maclean's as I made at the Post? That question has an answer, but I haven't thought of what the answer is in a long time, and I wasn't thinking too hard about it at the time. I was making enough.
Yeah.
Enough
to be willing to contribute more than what they just wanted.
Yeah. The blog was free labor for a company that didn't know what to do with it.
So what's the main difference then between the newspaper and the magazine, the writing?
At a magazine, you're more often introducing the topic to people who haven't been thinking about what. Like newspaper, you're part of the daily news package. Mm-hmm. Your audience is people who probably have at least a passing acquaintance with what else is in the paper. And at the Post, we would very often run a column next to the news story on the same topic. So I could start in the first paragraph. I could make a joke about whoever the figure was, the minister of whatever. At a magazine, especially a magazine like Maclean's in a country like Canada, this might be the only time they're thinking about politics all week long. There's a very good chance this is the only time they're going to think about whatever my topic is. So I had to spend the first half of the column just telling you what I'm talking about. Well, it can be very difficult for a small province to have the same services as a big province. This is the case in New Brunswick. The guy who's tasked with figuring out how to square that circle is the Premier of New Brunswick, hoop-de-doo, right? And so there's, I think my magazine writing, especially the writing for print, was much more pedagogical. I was simply telling people what was going on in the country.
Instructive.
Yeah. Typically, it was the setup for the second half of the column where I would say what I thought about things. But that setup work was not optional because I had no basis for assuming that people knew what I was talking about.
Right.
So what does that mean? It means my magazine writing was almost immediately a lot less funny than my newspaper writing. You can't start cracking wise until you've got a shared basis for humor.
So we should read your newspapers and not your magazine?
Well, it depends what you're looking for. I mean, I have loved doing this work for as long as I've been doing it, but it's not my art. It's my function. I'm trying to help people. And so I don't have a lot of, there's just not a lot of room in my head for me to bemoan a situation like needing to explain before I can tell the joke. That's just the gig now. You know, in 2003 when I went to Maclean's, this is a craft more than it's an art, and sometimes it's essentially like working at a public utility, right? Like I want people to leave the interaction understanding things better than before, and it's my job to help that to happen more than it's their fault if it doesn't happen.
You say on your Substack, you say, I want everything I publish to be worth your time.
Yeah.
Has that been your whole life's philosophy?
Yeah, although the you is flexible, right? Like a lot of what I write is a pure waste of time for people who aren't interested in how they're governed or live in, but that specific thing I think it was near the beginning of it was probably from my sort of launch manifesto when I launched the Substack. It was because I'd seen some other people making Substacks, writing newsletters, and very often what they do is they send you stuff at least once a day, sometimes more often than that, and you grow to resent them. I mean, lately my open rate for my newsletter has dipped from the low 60s to the mid 50s, right? So instead of 63% opening a given post, it's now like 55.
Because it's too frequent, you think?
Well, the novelty's worn off. Like that open rate is...
That's really good.
Anyone selling a product would kill for that open rate, right?
Yeah.
But I tell you, it keeps me up at night wondering how I can get it back up to 62, Organizations selling a product or trying to, interest groups and stuff like that, they're used to 4 or 5, 6% open rates. Because they understand that they're essentially unwanted, right? And these higher rates are because you're providing something that somebody wants. You're
paying for it.
You're speaking to your people,
right?
There's a marketing guru named Seth Godin who talks about subscription. The idea, and subscription not in the sense of filling out a subscription form, but of making a sort of a moral decision that you're going to be part of a conversation that's up because it gives you something, and. I don't ever want my subscribers to be like, fuck, him again.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they'll cancel their subscription.
Yeah.
But if you can just get into something a bit more general about writing about politics, and that is I.F. Stone.
Oh, yeah.
My father wrote a newsletter, incidentally, back in the 70s and 80s, and he spent time with I.F. Stone. He was sort of his hero. I.F. Stone said, every government is run by liars. Nothing they say should be believed. And you've been touching on that a bit lately.
Yeah.
I just wonder what it's like to know that you're being lied to, first of all, and neither of the two leaders have done interviews with you in years. And even if they did do interviews with you, it'd all be bullshit anyway. Yeah. What's it like to live with that?
Sometimes it's really annoying. But I would pick a fight with Izzy Stone, I don't know, but I don't think most people in politics think they're lying most of the time. I think they are
not telling the whole truth.
Yeah, or they're kidding themselves, or they're being over optimistic, or they're picking the part that they want to tell you. But I mean, I think very highly of most people in public life. I think they work hard. I think they are trying their best. I think they are astonished at how much influence they end up having on events. Like, they actually thought they could make a difference, and it's not a pure waste of your time, but it's super hard to actually make a difference, And they're kind of despondent. And then people like me come swanning in, and we only ask the hard questions, and we only use the embarrassing quotes. So I've got a lot of empathy for their side of our interaction. But my gentle and repeated advice to these people is that it actually goes better if you admit more of your humanity and the complexity of the problem and your fallibility than if you deny that those things exist.
The problem is they're acting, and you bring this up in your work, they aren't saying anything. They're repeating advertising messages and putting that into every fucking thing that they say.
Yeah.
And it's offensive to anyone who expects, something intelligible out of your leaders.
Yeah.
And it's coming from both major parties.
So, a few things. First of all, the number of people who can extemporaneously field a difficult question and provide useful information, that's not something everyone's born with, and that's not something everyone can even develop. And in that world, it's awful nice to have a formula that you can recite that gets you out of the corner that you're stuck in. So I don't have a lot of problem with people who help politicians communicate. I just think that surviving a scrum isn't the only goal of communications. At some point, one of the goals of communication should be to communicate, which has a few parts.
You can tell the truth about what's going on.
Discuss an issue in its complexity and listen to the feedback. And people who go in armed only with a slogan, they can't do anything with the feedback that they might get. And so that trains them to not listen to feedback, I mean, I could name.
Why don't you?
Well, because some of them are nice people. Prominent people in government who, if you run into them in a private setting, immediately just start talking real fast. And I don't even think they realize that part of the reason they're doing it is so that the person they're talking to can't say anything back to them. Right? Chrétien was pretty good at that, and his MPs used to call it the wall of words. Why don't they want anyone else to talk? Because when someone's talking to you, you have to decide how to respond, and they have no idea how to respond. So they try and make sure you won't talk. Anyway.
Mm. Let me read another I.F. Stone quote here. I sought in political reporting what Galsworthy, in another context, called the significant trifle, the bit of dialogue, the overlooked fact, the buried observation which illuminated the realities of the situation. That ring true with you?
Yeah, I mean, it at a minimum, it's a very common writer's practice is to you find something evocative in a moment or a scene, and you throw it out there, and that gets people imagining that they can see the whole thing. Right. So I'm talking to you in an office that has a big poster on the wall of Bix Beiderbecke, the 1920s American jazz trumpeter. As soon as I say that, there's a poster of Bix Beiderbecke on the wall. Anyone listening thinks they can see the whole office, right? I wrote once that Lloyd Axworthy in the House of Commons always sounded like he was snacking on a muffin when he was talking, which is cruel. I'm not sure I'd write it today. But that gives you a really strong sense of what Lloyd Axworthy sounds like.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And once you have one detail, your mind just fills in all the other details. Mm-hmm. Your mind's wrong about almost all of it, but that doesn't matter. Like you can...
Well, this is great writing, allows space for the reader to figure stuff out.
It's collaborative.
Do things.
It's why movies of a book that you love are almost always disappointing, right? Because you know what it looks like and it doesn't look like that.
That's right.
So,
it's like the Odessa File.
Yeah.
The Odessa File had a shitty old Mercedes in it, and I think it was a Jaguar that was in the book.
Okay.
Really annoyed me.
Well, this is it, you know. So yeah, and similarly, if I haven't written anything about the federal budget that just came out, but if I had, my task would be to find something in there that I can explain in 40 words that will stand in for the 600 pages of the budget document. And you're going to have greater or less success at that, but if you can't do it at all, then you shouldn't be writing about budgets, you know. So, and half the time I spend in those budget lockups is just trying to figure out what's a way to describe this thing that honors it instead of caricaturing it. Although honor might be too strong, I do like the caricature. But anyway.
Well, give the essence of it.
Yeah.
So writing for magazines, you have to give a bit more context, and you can't be as flippant or funny.
Yeah, you can't. One element of comedy is a shared set of understandings about what's going on and what part of it is funny or can be seen to be funny. Mm-hmm. So you can't start that work until people are on the same page. Okay. So I figured for my own technique, my own method, my own sense of peace with myself, I decided early on that I had to do that groundwork before I could start showing off. Right. You know.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. And what about books then?
So I wasted my youth, although that's not how it felt at the time. I mean, I read very little besides science fiction until I was near the end of high school. Mm-hmm. I thought people who wrote about like the real world and that they were just intellectually limited. Like, why would you write about a world that exists? We've already got that one. Why wouldn't you make up another world? You know. And,
although that's entirely what fiction is making up another world.
Yeah, but why would you make up one where people
not out in space, but here and on Earth?
Yeah, why would you make up a world where people eat at McDonald's and like? Mm-hmm. Again, I'm describing in pre-adolescent and adolescent mindset. I would make the occasional, like, look, as you know, when you're in school, they throw books at you and you've got to read them, at least some of them, and some of them were actually pretty good. So I found that surprising. And then as soon as I thought I was going to start to write for a living, then my reader's diet changed almost immediately. And I started to seek out stuff that would be admirable for the quality of the sentences and then for the quality of, you know, larger stretches of land. Like if you're going to run a marathon, you need to eat well. And so for me, that was George Orwell. It was John Steinbeck. It was Hemingway up to a point. It was very sort of 1950s boy's own conception of what good literature is. And then I went further and further afield as I went on. John Irving, Mordecai Richler, much later Joan Didion, Kafka, like whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But that was very much, that was me being guided by a desired end, not by a simple yearning for what the next thing to read should be.
A desired end?
A desired end.
A desired end.
Like I wanted to be a better writer, so I had to read better writers.
Right. Hemingway had a list of great books to read.
Yeah. I probably would have done better to read that off of that list than to read Hemingway.
The early Hemingway is pretty good.
I was baffled. Almost all of my friends in university, by the nature of things, were more literary than I was.
Were you in literature? Were you studying?
I was failed at a second year chemistry, and I went into political science.
Okay.
But at a campus paper, you get a lot of English majors and film majors, and
yes, you were the editor at West.
I was the news editor. Yeah. Anyway, all my artsy friends loved Hemingway, and I would read some Hemingway, and I'd be like, probably if I went back, I'd have a much better understanding. But at the time, I was like, not impressed.
Mm-hmm. It's good to have a strong opinion.
Yeah.
If you could back it up.
Well, so I used to, when I would go in as like a guest lecturer in journalism classes and stuff like this, I would go in with a list of writing that had influenced me. Mm-hmm. And I stopped doing that because I understood that 90% of why it influenced me was not any inherent quality. It was just that there was something in the theme or, that resonated with me. And so
at that time,
more recently, I say, find find some writing that you care about and let it influence you rather than reading my stale list.
Something you revel in.
Yeah.
So what about you writing books, though? What's the difference between your writing your monthly or weekly column and you writing the book about Harper and Paul Martin? And
Yeah.
I read the Harper one. That's the one after Harper, right?
Well, so the first book I wrote, the first book I finished, was Right Side Up, which is about the 2006 election substantially, and the second one I wrote was The Longer I'm Prime Minister, which is the big book about Harper, and that's 2013. It's a natural extension of writing magazine journalism.
Why is that?
Once you can handle 1,000 words, then can you do 3,000? And once you can do 3,000, can you do 18,000? And once you've done that, then what's your excuse if you're not writing a book? Mm-hmm. And I actually felt that it's a lot of what I do is in relation to the industry. And I thought, look, if the columnist at Maclean's magazine is not writing books, then he's snubbing the extraordinary opportunity that the job entails, which is fuck off for 5 days and then mail a column in and spend 4 of those 5 days working on a book project, and which is what Peter C. Newman did, and
he sold hundreds of thousands of copies of the books.
Yeah, I wasn't really good at that part of the formula, but there should be books about Canadian politics. I've been blessed with a situation that's much more congenial than most working journalists. So why am I not using that luxury to produce something?
So you felt a responsibility then?
Yeah.
But the actual writing itself is what? Just stringing 1,000 words here, 2,000, and going chronologically, or what is it?
No, I mean, so when I started to write longer magazine pieces, so beginning in 2006, and for several elections afterwards, we would produce a very long piece about how the election was won and lost. 18,000 words in 2006 and up to 24,000 words in later elections. And if it's only chronological, then people will hate you because that just feels like reliving the election. So it has to be thematic. It has to be, and then you have to ask yourself some questions about structure. And to me, that's part of the appeal of writing a book. It's not only what's it about, what have I found out about the topic. It's how can I present it using all of the techniques that are available to
fiction writers,
novelists, to TV showrunners, to is there room for a flashback? Is there room for a more theoretical, insert a more theoretical discussion into what's mostly descriptive? Can I address academic writing that's on the same topic? Can I have something just ridiculous, have essentially a comic break from all the serious stuff? Can I
keep people turning the pages?
Yeah, and also just take advantage of everything that's available to anyone who thinks about how words can go together. Poetry, rock and roll lyrics. Not that I would write poetry, that I would write lyrics or anything, but are you open to being influenced by all the stuff that's in the air? I mean, too many of my colleagues, when it comes time for them to write their book, what they show is they've never read a book, or they've never thought about.
How do they do that? Because it's just
rote chronology. Yeah. It is. This is a much higher level of accomplishment, but here on my desk is this book, The Times, by Adam Nagurney, which is a history of the New York Times from 1977 to about 2015. And he's interviewed hundreds of people. He's a Times man himself, so he has access, but he almost never pauses from the narrative to write even a page of analysis.
Got good or bad?
I think it's a huge letdown. I mean, what does all of this mean?
It's just like reporting.
I'm reading his notebook, and he's got a dynamite notebook because he's in a great newspaper, and the people who made all these decisions talk to him.
Does he put himself into it and talk about how he reacted?
Basically not at all. As a matter of fact, he closes the narrative off almost a decade ago because he said he doesn't want to write about the people that he works with. I'm like, well, why in the name of God would you not want to, like?
Sorry to interrupt, but I interviewed John Sargent recently, the head of Macmillan, and he had written a memoir. And his editor, John Galassi, said, put more of yourself in it.
Yeah. And you can put too much of yourself in. Like, I mean,
and I think that was it. He's just feeling humble.
Yeah. And there's room for all kinds of books, like literally all kinds of books.
But you want it to entertain you, and it's not entertaining.
Well, I just think it ends up being the story of 2 or 3 major cultural transformations at the country's, really the English-speaking world's leading newspaper. And he would say, look, Wells, you seem not to be an idiot. You can figure that shit out for yourself, and I kind of get that, and I have. But I prefer to pause and plant my feet and say, you see what's going on here, don't you? Like, it seems like just a bunch of lunches at Le Bernardin, but in fact, it's a newspaper that is realizing it no longer has to account to its advertisers, it has to account to its readers, because the ad market's vanishing. Times is moving to a subscription model, and there's a hell of a lot of implications of that. And
wonderful implications.
Yeah, and not so much. I mean, the Times used to know its own soul because it had to keep the advertisers at bay by the traditions of the craft. Now it spends so much of its time sucking up to its readers because its readers are its subscribers, And I think it has lost a bit of its soul. And I'll tell you, at a trivially smaller level, these are things I think about all the time.
Well, I was going to say, this is exactly what's happened with Substack. And you don't have to rely on advertising.
And I do have to rely on subscribers. And then the question is, how much of this is me and how much of this is them? And I decided early on that it's going to be, I would try to be courteous. I would try to always listen to the feedback I get, but that I don't take requests. And if someone says, why are you not writing about this, or why are you not holding this opinion of Justin Trudeau, right? And I get that shit all the time, right? I had someone who wrote to me, I quoted Susan Delacourt from the Toronto Star in something I wrote a few days ago, and I had someone say, well, anyone who quotes Susan Delacourt, you're not getting a dime of my money. And I didn't answer, but I thought, I'm glad we understand each other. But I'm
maybe not giving you the money in the first place, or was he paying?
It's better if I don't check that.
Okay.
If I'm not trying to figure that,
Yeah.
But to get back to this book about the Times, I think there's a limit to how much you can show. And at some point you have to tell. And at some point you have to meditate, contemplate, and share your contemplation with a reader. Well,
here's what you say. You say, I quoted this earlier before, I want everything I publish to be worth your time. Analysis, context, what I think, but also what I've seen, heard, learned, and discovered. And you also talk about wanting to clarify your reader's day. Maybe there's not enough clarification here, or there's not enough what he thinks.
I think it's a little too easy to my advice to any writer would be, I don't just want to know what you've seen. I also want to know what thoughts it inspires in your head.
Ideas, new ideas.
Yeah, and some sense of how it challenges your priorities or your preconceptions, or confirms your fondest theories, or whatever, So, golly, this is unfair, but contrast this book about the New York Times with Young Men in Fire, which is the last book that Norman Maclean wrote. As a matter of fact, it was published posthumously. And it's about a bunch of young men, airborne parachuting forest firefighters in Montana in the 1940s, who went to handle a fire that was bigger than they expected, and most of them died. And Maclean, who comes from Montana and had worked in the fire service, spent the last several years of his life trying to piece together this horrible incident, right? So it's a feat of this was on my list of stuff that I would recommend to young reporters, and then I stopped recommending anything specific. But it's a heroic feat of reporting, retracing the steps of each guy based on obviously charred and partial evidence. But it's also really a heartbreaking meditation on what it's like to be young and suddenly hopeless, and to have done your best in difficult circumstances and it's not good enough. And it ends up being a parallel to the last days of his wife's life, because she died of respiratory failure at an advanced age, and you just know that what made him pursue this very different story is watching his wife die and wondering what it's like not to be able to breathe, right? Like, that is so heavy. Like, it's so beautiful. It's so terrible.
Emotional.
Yeah.
It's emotional.
Yeah. I'm just crazy enough to think that there should be some of that in a book that I write about Stephen Harper. You know?
So it's going to be yours emotion, not his emotion.
Yeah, it's going to be it's a meeting. Classical music, since Haydn, is one theme meets another theme, and then they work it out. You know, and that's how that music was an advance over all the amazing music that came before it. Was about reconciling difference, and to me that's part of, you know, that's part of what you write a book to do, is I go out into the world and enter into a dialogue with events. I don't just recount events.
Yeah.
So
lovely. Okay, so we've done newspapers, magazines, books.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saving Substack for the end.
There you go.
And a bit of math. 15,000 times 60 is 900,000.
Dollars? Or yeah, if I had that 15,000 people paying me, absolutely. But the number that I share...
You shared 15,000. That was stuck in my head, and I couldn't believe it.
The number I share is always the total number of subscribers. And as I always say after that, most don't pay. And
I missed that part.
And yeah. And
okay.
And what I don't tell almost anyone is what the smaller number is.
No. You're going to tell me?
No.
No one's listening.
Well, that would change fast. I remember at the National Post, one of our...
Sorry, just before you go there, like the newspapers, some of their circulation were what, 300,000-400,000?
Yeah.
It seems to me that many of them would be, and Maclean's it was up around that. Many of them would be reading for you. So why can't you get 15,000 up? 15,000 is, I think you mentioned this. It's like the local newspaper in Sarnia.
Yeah. Well, so I'm not sure it's impossible for me to reach that number in time, but it takes time. I mean, I shared some trade secrets with my friends at The Line, which is this other Substack that's Matt Gurney and Jen Gerson, and
what did you share with them?
Well, I just asked them what can I look forward to, and they said, well, we reached a certain level after 2 years, and what that taught me was it's not instant. Like, you know.
What level did they reach, or did they tell you?
They reached a nice level. I'm not gonna.
Nice as 500,000.
No. I mean, it really matters that we're in the Canadian market, which is 1/10.
Well, this is the thing. I was stupidly thinking that Paul Wells has 15,000 paid subscribers, and how on earth do you do that? You're doing that writing about Canadian politics, and I'm thinking this is insane.
Yeah,
so I guess I was.
It's literally insane.
Yeah. But you can make a really good living, right? Because I mean, you're happier than you've ever been.
Yeah, but I'm happier than I've ever been because I'm married, and I wasn't for the longest time.
When did you get married?
8 years ago, 9 years ago.
I am still happy. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, it's better. And no one's telling me what to write.
Yeah. No one's editing you.
I don't have a major sugar daddy that I need to keep happy, right? I can. My business model is the law of averages. As long as someone out there likes my stuff enough to pay me, then off we go. Mm-hmm. So, and I think it's important to be cryptic about how much money I'm making, because that's not the point. If the point was to make money, I'd have gone to Hill and Knowlton or Navigator, and I would have, the point is to
sold your soul.
The point is to, and if the money's good enough, I'll sell it. But in the meantime, this allows me to do what I was born to do. I mean, I'm kind of admitting to myself that this is my life.
You're calling.
Yeah. So.
I'm not going to say my estimation of you has fallen. Money is not the issue, but I was I thought you had 15,000 subscribers.
Yeah. Well, I promise you I have substantially less. Well, again, it depends on subscribers. I think of the people who don't pay as my subscribers. Like, I think of them as part of my audience.
Yeah.
Because
they're potential paying subscribers.
They're potential paying subscribers, but also part of what I do is persuade newsmakers to talk to me. And one reason they should talk to me is because, like, the current total number, not paid. Total number is 23,000 people.
That's significant.
If the Premier of Quebec would ever notice that and think about it, he would think, man, if I've got something to say to Canada, I could say it to 23,000 people who will hang on every word.
Yeah, who are engaged.
Yeah, or I could scrum for CBC Quebec City and...
Yeah, but they've got a lot of viewers.
Yeah, but they got a lot of distracted viewers. They edit the thing much more,
Yeah.
And, anyway, different public figures do the math differently and make their own decisions. And
yes.
There's a hell of a lot of people who don't talk to me. More and more people talk to me because they understand that my subscribers are a valuable crowd. And they're valuable regardless of whether they want to send me any money. That's a very partial and limited way to understand it. So I don't ever say to someone,
when are you going to subscribe?
You don't get to have an opinion because you didn't send me a check. And not because that's rude or because it's arrogant but because it would be stupid. Because it would be me misunderstanding the relative value of different parts of the public. So.
Well, and they add to an interesting conversation that takes place on your Substack.
Although I mostly let only paying subscribers comment.
That's a motivation. I subscribed to Margaret Atwood's, and who's in the lineup to talk about Substack.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know how many paying subscribers she got just by shifting over. But I was so revved up about her French Revue series. I wanted to post something on it, so I paid to post.
Yeah.
This is smart.
My thing is mostly to make sure that the comment board doesn't grow like Topsy. Once it gets past about 100 comments on a given piece, it's usually two diehards at the end who hate each other. And so I try and not let it get to that point.
Okay. So, just in closing, could you give us some intelligence on why you've succeeded on Substack?
Some of it is mechanical. I post regularly so that people have a feeling that I'm making them part of my day and that I mean this and that I'm taking this seriously. Somebody really smart, and I wish I remembered who it was. It was probably Jen Gerson, but I don't remember for sure. Just before I launched, somebody said, don't treat this as your blog. In other words, don't treat it as a scratch pad where you can put any old crap up, right?
Make it worth the reader's while.
Yeah. Put on better clothes than your most comfortable clothes. Look someone in the eye, So it's much closer to my magazine writing than it is to when I'm texting a buddy, And then I'm consciously trying to fill a niche. And it's a niche that used to get filled all the time in our journalism. When every Southern paper in the 80s had a weekend supplement, and somebody at those papers had a couple thousand words to weigh in on how's the health minister doing this week, or What's going to happen to the regional dynamics of this political fight, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
The journalism I grew up with is much harder to find than it used to be. But that gives me a competitive advantage. I can provide it. and I think it calls to people who feel like they're not getting everything they should be getting out of our political conversations. And so...
is that why it matters?
I mean, it matters to the extent that each member in the audience wants it to matter. I mean, I'm a bit fatalist about this. Like, I'll let other people decide how important I am to them. But that's why it matters to me.
It matters to you because a conversation about politics, engagement is essential for our, democracy, freedom?
Yeah, our ability to get along, or at least to understand one another as neighbors. I mean, I was an undergrad and then a young journalist during the debates over free trade at the end of the 80s, over Meech Lake, the run-up to the Quebec referendum, the fight between a sort of a Thatcherite right and a Clinton-esque center, and a labor left that was turning into a sort of a multicultural urban left. And, like, it's tremendously unsatisfying, if that's how you grow up thinking about politics, to find yourself in a world where people just throw slogans at each other. And, you know,
Well, part of your job is to express that dissatisfaction.
I'm surprised how much of my writing and thinking these days is about how we talk to one another. That wasn't part of the plan, but I don't think it's accessory to our problems. I think it's becoming central to our problems. So it's something for me to write about.
Just final question.
Yep.
About your marriage. How come it's going so well after 8 years?
Sometimes a guy gets lucky, and the same sort of thing. When you hit a rough patch, that doesn't relieve you of an obligation to listen to the other person and to assume that they mean well. And so we love each other. We find each other hilarious, but we also respect each other. And respecting means you can't win every time. Even I don't get to win every time.
Well, I just won. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Paul Wells is, now maybe you can tell me, what are you?
Sole proprietor of the Paul Wells newsletter. When I go on TV, I just say journalist and author.
And they can find you on just Paul Wells Substack, right?
Yeah, if you Google those words, or the URL is paulwells.substack.com.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.